In this lesson, we're continuing to talk about the structure and role of Parliament, focusing now not necessarily on the main chambers of Parliament, i.e., the House of Commons or the House of Lords, but more on the committee system that exists within Parliament itself. We'll talk about the different kinds of committees that exist, whether they be standing committees or more temporary committees for particular purposes. We'll talk about the role of the committee process, as well as the powers and influence they have over the passage of legislation. So much of the very important work that is carried out, the fine details in relation to the passing of legislation, is actually carried out not in the House of Commons itself, but mainly by committees within the House of Commons. So the committees are numerous in that there are multiple different kinds of committees for both different purposes and also for different types of legislation and different areas of policy. And they also perform a variety of different functions, depending on which committee we are talking about. So, for example, we have committees of the whole House, we have public bill and general committees, we have select committees, and we also have departmental select committees, business committees, etc., etc., etc. So that's a non-exhaustive list of the different kinds of committees that we have, and we'll get into some of these committees in more detail as we go on in the rest of this lesson. And you can already see straight away from the titles of these committees, really what some of these functions are, what some of the powers these committees have, and also the influence that some of these committees have over the different types of legislation that is passed within the House of Commons. So let's begin by talking about one of the most common, most popular kinds of committees. This is the idea of a select committee. Now, there are a number of different kinds of select committee. Some are more correctly described as being joint select committees, since a lot of them don't necessarily refer to and have membership from one single chamber. They can be jointly chaired by multiple different members from both houses of Commons and the House of Lords. So these are what we would more aptly title the joint select committees. And this is, again, they represent a union of House of Commons and House of Lords. Select committees share one common feature, and that is the fact that the select committees are permanently standing. So they are permanent committees that you don't create for the purpose of one particular thing, etc., etc. So the membership of select committees will vary with time. New members are appointed by the selection committee, and existing members eventually cease to serve on the committee as well. They will produce a report, and the government will have to reply to the report within 60 days of that production, of the production of said report. The aim here is, of course, to provide a role for holding the government to account, which is essentially one of the main features and one of the main functionalities that exists with Parliament. And they do so through numerous different means and methods, and the select committee process is one of them. Now, essentially, these reports that exist will have a number of different findings, and it will be a requirement that the government carry out on these findings, carry out and make changes to whatever policy, whatever action that they are being scrutinized for. Through the findings or the recommendations, and they'll have 60 days to reply to the report in question. Now, between 1997 and 2010, there were over 1,500 reports published by select committees, and this led to the creation of over 40,000 recommendations. So you can see, just in the period of the Labour governments of New Labour, just how much work was done by various select committees over the years, over the period of just over 10 years, in relation to policy and to legislation that was being passed through Parliament. And so, if you see here just how many recommendations that were made, and the fact that the government has to act on and respond to each of these recommendations, you can see just how much of an influence the select committee process has over the passage of legislation and the holding government to account. We also have domestic committees. So formerly, there were 5 domestic committees which considered provisions of services within the House of Commons. So from July 2005, these were replaced by a single committee, and this became known as the Administration Committee. There are more examples of domestic committees that have existed and do exist. So for example, we have the Liaison Committee and the Committee on Standards and Privileges. The Liaison Committee was appointed to consider and advise the House of Commons on matters relating to the work and the functioning of the select committees. So the Liaison Committee is almost like a committee which scrutinises and essentially checks the functioning of the select committees. So it's almost a committee's committee in that regard. One of the most important functions of the Liaison Committee performs is to hear evidence from the Prime Minister on matters of public policy. The former Prime Minister Tony Blair has described once in the past the Liaison Committee and appearing before the Liaison Committee as quote-unquote extremely tough. He has also compared it favourably to Prime Minister's questions. Several committees are concerned with the scrutiny of proposed legislation. These include the Regulatory Reform Committee, the European Scrutiny Committee, the Statutory Instruments Committee, the Consolidation of Bills Committee, and the Human Rights Committee. Again, specifically relating to individual things in conjunction with different areas of policy, whether or not it be statutory instruments or human rights, etc., etc. In addition to this, we also have departmental select committees. The system of departmental select committees was originally established in 1979, and departmental select committees essentially mirror government departments. So a change in the structure of a government department by, for example, the amalgamation of another department or subdivision into 2 departments will be reflected at the committee level. So where a new government department is created, or where government departments merge or separate in terms of their functions and their application to policy, this will be reflected within the departmental select committee system. So departmental select committees are appointed to, quote, examine the expenditure, administration and policy of the principal government departments, associated public bodies or associated public bodies. So essentially, the aim of the departmental select committees is to scrutinise that particular department in relation to expenditure, administration and policy. This is the case as per Standing Order 152, Part 1. They generally do not concern themselves with the drafting of specific legislation, unless the committee stage of a bill has been referred to them by the House of Commons. So we will get to the legislative process, in fact, in the next lesson, and we'll talk about how legislation is actually passed through Parliament, and we will talk about the committee stage of the bill when we get onto that in the next lesson. But generally speaking, when it comes to the passing of legislation and draft legislation, i.e. bills, departmental select committees do not often concern themselves with that particular stage of the process, but they will concern themselves with that stage of the process if the committee stage of a bill has referred to them by the House of Commons.